Hello and welcome to The Point World Affairs. I'm Tae Sang-mi. The European Union continued to see a flurry of chaos and confusion this year. The Yellow Vest protesters in France continue to hit the streets, while the UK is seeing increasing division within the country with just about 2 months left until Brexit. What would the European Union look like in 2019? For that, we have with us Professor Paul Tonks, Associate Vice President for International Affairs at Yonsei University. Thank you for joining us again today.
Thank you.
The Yellow Vest movement spread like wildfire in France starting late last year over an increase in oil tax. While the protests seem to have died down after President Emmanuel Macron withdrew the oil tax hike and increased the minimum wage, protesters have hit to the streets again in the new year. The demonstrators said they have no intentions of backing down despite President Macron's announcement to consider strong gestures to end the fiery tax protests.
On a le droit de se révolter parce que voilà, ils n'ont pas le droit de nous laisser comme ça dans la merde. Nous, on en a marre de payer, on veut plus de ça, de cet esclavage. Tout le monde se serre la ceinture depuis 15-20 ans. Il y en a marre. Le temps des serfs et des seigneurs, on y est toujours là, 2019.
The public's anger towards the upper echelon is spreading beyond France. Various forms of the Yellow Vest movement is taking place across Europe, from the demonstrations in Belgium over oil taxes and Hungary's protests against its labor law. The reasons for the uprise are cited as the widening gap between the rich and the poor, as well as a bad job market in Europe. 2019 marks the 20th anniversary of the euro, which has unified Europe into a single market. Yet the economic bloc failed to prevent the financial crises that first broke out in Greece in 2008 before spreading to Ireland and Portugal. As a result, populist political parties have been questioning the validity of the single currency market, creating a rift within the European Union. In fact, with just months before Brexit, the EU is facing its biggest political and economic crisis to date. Also, with German Chancellor Angela Merkel having announced her imminent retirement from politics and President Macron suffering a blow to his leadership due to violent anti-government protests, the future of the EU does not seem so bright. In the midst of this current crisis, many around the world are anticipating the European Parliament elections set to take place in May, which is set to bring about vast changes to the political landscape of the EU. On this week's The Point World Affairs, we discuss the many changes and challenges in store for Europe in 2019.
So, Professor, Europe is not doing so well recently. It seems like both economically and politically. And there are a lot of protests we see across the continent, really, in France, Italy, Belgium even. So why do you think it's like this?
I think there are shared problems across Europe, like there are actually in many regions of the world. I think ultimately the real fundamental cause is the legacy of the financial crisis of 2008. So in the last decade, of course, there have been many policy changes and many political events, elections of new leaders and so forth. But I think fundamentally, the problems that came to the fore then haven't been resolved, both politically and economically.
Right. When we look at Europe, though, it has been keeping peace for the last 70 years since the World War II. It's a long time of peace, really. But when we look at just last year, 2018, it was really a year of turmoil, some people say. Right. A lot of protests, a lot of populists rising, and just a lot of leadership issues on the continent. Right. So can you tell us what is the fundamental reason for this turmoil in Europe?
I think there's been a breakdown of faith in government and in what one might call the political elite, the leaders of countries, the traditional party system, perhaps that has functioned since at least the aftermath of World War II. So I think we are living now in a new, perhaps an unprecedented time period in which, if you like, the faith in governments on a national level and also some of the multilateral organizations and institutions, most importantly the European Union, has started perhaps to break down. And so it's unclear how governments can effectively respond to that. But it's clear that there's a lot of popular discontent, disappointment with the situation that people find themselves in, the working class and middle class people. As I said, I think a lot of that can be traced back to the financial crisis.
Okay, let's connect to an expert in Germany. To glean more information on the current situation in Europe, joining me now is Christoph Hermann, Professor of European Law at University of Passau in Germany. Thank you for joining us, Professor.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be with you.
There are a lot of analysis that Europe will be facing a lot of crisis, both economically and politically this year. So how do you evaluate the current situation, and also what are we expecting in 2019?
Brexit is, of course, top of the agenda until March, and then there is the upcoming European Parliament elections in June. And the question there will be, to what extent will right-wing populist parties make it into the European Parliament? And there is another big meeting of the heads of state and government in May after Brexit, talking about the future direction for the European Union. The current Commission President Juncker has prepared a white paper 1.5 years ago, describing different options for the future development, further development into a political union, or going rather back into the customs union and internal market situation, etc. And that is going to be discussed. But I guess there will be a half a year now with very intense discussions about Brexit and the European Parliament election, and the second half of the year will be dealing with the building of a new EU Commission, because after the Parliament election, a new Commission comes into place, so there will be a successor to President Juncker, and then besides, we of course have the problems with in France and in Germany with the current governments, with Angela Merkel, maybe, or the possibility of her stepping down as chancellor, maybe, or the breaking up of the Grand Coalition, and in France, the problems of President Macron with the current protests in the streets. So I think that's the biggest topics to watch this year.
Thank you very much. That was Professor Christoph Hermann from University of Passau. Now, Professor, it seems like even though European Union is one union, one economic bloc, and also it is on the same continent, it seems like there is like a huge economic gap among its member nations. So maybe do you think this is the reason behind this continuous conflict?
I think that's a very fair comment, a very fair question. That also, I think, leads back to the topic we were discussing at the beginning in terms of the sort of complex legacy of the financial crisis. I think there are clearly enormous structural differences between different regions of Europe, between the southern Mediterranean countries, the so-called PIGS, and Northern Europe countries such as Germany, of course, and the Netherlands and other countries. Very different basis in terms of, let's say, things such as the role of manufacturing and exports in the economy. And so obviously having a system where one is trying to devise policies for such different types of economy and try to create a unified policy that can work in the interests of countries as diverse as, let's say, Greece and Germany is a tremendously challenging task, I think, for the European Union. And I think the last decade or so, it's still being worked out, for example, in a country such as Greece that has really never recovered, essentially, from the financial crisis.
Speaking of financial crisis, you know, the euro, the currency they're sharing, it's actually this year marks the 20th anniversary of the creation of this monetary rights system. So how was this? What do you think? Does this really help for integration of the European Union members?
The kinds of mechanisms that we've seen, the policies, for example, the fiscal policies, things like the European Central Bank interest rates, clearly are going to affect very differently a extremely heavily indebted country such as Greece. rather than a country which is still one of the largest, most dominant exporters in the world, such as Germany. So I think that difficulty of coordination, of having policies across such diverse economies, I think that's one of the big issues that we're seeing. I think certainly the euro has, though, played a positive role in terms of, shall we say, deepening and integrating the market, allowing greater and easier trade to occur. I think most people would share that view.
Okay, let's connect to another local expert. We continue our discussions with another expert in Brussels. Joining me now is Joachim Kobs, Director of the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at the University of Leiden. Welcome, Professor.
Yeah, many thanks for having me on.
The Yellow Vest movement continues to sweep France this year. The protests have spread to Belgium as well. Tell us what the current situation is there right now and the reason for the spread.
Yeah, it's true that that protest, that is a complex combination of very disenchanted working class people that are against essentially rising taxes, but also generally disenchanted with the political system and the living situation, wage stagnation, and in general a very difficult income situation. That this now has become a regular protest every Saturday, in fact, often also spiked with violence in France. And as you rightly said, there are now kind of new chapters, so to say, arising in different neighboring countries. So we've seen it in Belgium, Brussels, before Christmas in particular, in the city center, up to 200 people. So not as large and not as violent as in France, but also it seems to become a kind of, I wouldn't say movement right now, but at least a kind of habit and situation that is also re-emerging in other countries.
So what do you think is the fundamental reason behind these continuous flurry of protests across Europe, including Italy, France, now in Belgium?
Well, I think, first of all, I think it's still specifically and very, it's France where it emerged and also where it's strongest. France itself has, of course, a very strong culture of open protest, of demonstrations, particularly when French citizens are dissatisfied with the political situation. So it's a combination of, on the one hand, Macron's, so the French president's, reform proposals. Of course, he's trying to do almost the impossible in France, which is reforming the welfare system, reforming the unemployment benefit system, but also essentially neoliberalizing the economy. That, of course, has met with lots of resistance already with organized protests, such as the trade unions, which play a strong role, but now also kind of populist resentment. And we shouldn't forget that Macron was elected on a platform that was supposed to be more, not only for more Europe, but also for more social justice. And he, of course, won against the far right, Le Pen, and the far right is, in fact, in France now growing slowly stronger again, also because of utilizing this kind of disenchantment of the general population in terms of, not realizing the ideal of social justice. That's on the one hand. Then whenever it turns violent, you also have certain subgroups that are simply interested in exploiting a situation for violent ends. This is not particularly organized.
Thank you. That was Professor Joachim Kobs, a security expert in Brussels. Professor, how about the populists, the rise of populists across the continent, really? Namely, in Italy, there was a populist coalition that was just sworn in recently. And not just Italy, but we've seen really last few years how so many countries have been really having this kind of trend of populism. So is this a serious issue, and what is it like?
Yes, I think that's also really a crucial point, I think, as our colleague was highlighting there. Clearly, there is a tremendous rise of populism. I think mainly there are dangerous signs of the far right in many parts of Europe, as Professor Kobs said. There's also, I think, a rise perhaps of the sort of radical, more extreme left. I think on all parts of the political spectrum, perhaps we might say, I think populism is a fair term. I think that reflects, as we were talking about before, this kind of breakdown of trust and kind of crisis of confidence, of belief, I think, in the ability of governments to tackle fundamental questions of concern for citizens. I think, obviously, the economic aspects, as Professor Koops was saying, the relative stagnation of wages and of living conditions is historically unprecedented, really. Many of your viewers, I'm sure, would be aware of the controversial but certainly very influential work of the French economist Thomas Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century. And I think whether one agrees with all his figures or not, I think this is an important analysis in terms of the difficulties for many people in even maintaining, let alone improving their living standards. And that's something really since, I would say, as a historian, since the 19th century, since the high industrial revolution period, we haven't really faced that kind of significant challenge in advanced Western developed countries. So I think that's something that one's seeing, obviously, in Europe, and one's seeing, of course, in the United States too. So I think those are interlinked.
Prime Minister Theresa May's Brexit deal was held at the House of Commons on January 15th.
The ayes to the right, 202. The noes to the left, 432.
The defeat is a huge blow for Prime Minister May, who has spent more than 2 years hammering out a deal with the EU. Despite her appeals for the deal to be passed, the Brexit deal was rejected by 230 votes, the largest defeat for a sitting government in British history. This has pushed the government there to hastily come up with a Plan B by January 21st. Possible scenarios include the government's postponement of Brexit or a second national referendum, an early general elections held by the main opposition Labour Party, or a no-deal Brexit in which the UK withdraws from the EU without any agreements. While Prime Minister May initially opposed a second referendum, saying it would further divide the nation, talks of a second referendum has resurfaced, with the initial agreement having been voted down. The European Union also publicly stated that it's willing to accept Britain back into the EU.
If the UK government sticks to its decision to leave, Brexit will become a reality with all its negative consequences in March next year.
Will Britain become the first country to leave the EU in 2019, or will it decide to stay instead? We connect with a local expert to understand what Brexit will mean in Europe's current political and economic predicament.
The UK was the first country to declare the withdrawal from the European Union, yet it's currently facing difficulties right now, especially with the UK Parliament rejecting the Brexit deal. Joining us now is Jan Zielonka, Professor of European Politics at the University of Oxford, also the author of recently published Counter-Revolution, Liberal Europe in Retreat. Good to have you on, Professor.
Good to be with you.
Possibilities of a second Brexit referendum are being discussed, as well as a possible postponement of Britain's withdrawal from the EU. What is the situation right now, and can Brexit actually be put off?
We can postpone it, we can even call it off. The problem is that nobody knows what will happen. Not even Theresa May, let alone you and me. This is bad enough. We pay for democracy to work out decisions which are giving certain signals to businesses and citizens what their life would look like next year, but we don't know.
Commentators say that Brexit is not going to just affect its economy, Britain's economy, but also influence on its security and the security of the common European Union as a whole. What do you think?
Because Europe is a very interdependent environment, and people in Europe used to move freely through borders. Those who moved through borders mostly were just ordinary citizens, but of course there were also some people, for instance, human traffickers and others, who represented security threat. And now the cooperation of dealing with this possible crime is being subject to the outcome of the negotiations of Brexit. So all this set of cooperation is being now threatened, or at least is going to be redesigned. This also relates to international affairs, although the European Union is not the main security actor here. But there is a lot of cooperations in the field of home and justice affairs between different police units and intelligence.
The European Parliament election is set to take place this May, and a lot of people, a lot of countries will be keeping close tabs on it because it will have direct influence on their economies, on their security as well. So what are we expecting this year from this election?
Well, we used to have politicians who advocated leaving the European Union. But after Brexit referendum, when people realize what is the price of leaving the European Union, those Eurosceptics got a different strategy. They said, instead of leaving the EU, we want to take control over it. And they want to make gains in these next elections. So it will be interesting. Who is going to gain, who is going to lose. And these elections will be probably the most important European elections ever.
Thank you, Professor Jan Zielonka from University of Oxford. Now, Professor, tell us a little bit about this parliament election that we are expecting in May.
I think my colleague makes an important point there. I think also to tie it into the perspective of the UK, or the experience of the UK, and perhaps how we got to the position of Brexit. I think in hindsight, looking back at the recent history, I think we can see what was very significant was the growth electorally of Euroscepticism, not just within the sort of mainstream now governing Conservative Party, but within the United Kingdom Independence Party. And so in a previous European Parliament election, simply put, they won the election, they got a very large number of seats. And I think that, in retrospect, we can see as a kind of predictor of the crisis to come, and eventually the vote for Brexit in 2016. I think it's likely to be the case, as our colleagues have been discussing, in that we will see manifest in those elections, I think, some of those issues of popular discontent, perhaps a greater showing of more radical and more populist parties outside of the mainstream of the sort of traditional left and right, the conservative and social democratic parts of the political spectrum in Europe. So I think it's quite likely that we may see radical, probably both on the right and on the sort of extreme left, if you like, will probably gain greater representation. I think that's something that is likely to occur.
Before I let you go, please tell us an advice or hopes for this European Union right now, a little bit of in limbo, really. Just tell us what they should be doing in 2019.
Ideally, they would be aiming for the kinds of coordination on policy, the kinds of cooperation that, of course, the European Union was formulated to achieve. You've highlighted, I think, very important issues such as security, as well as, which of course would affect many parts of the world, very important in terms of international relations and security, including, for example, here in East Asia. So I think, ideally, the leadership of the EU would be able to exert enough influence to be able to work together successfully. I think, in a sense, paradoxically, the very painful and problematic issues with Brexit may actually, in a certain sense, point towards a more optimistic outcome. I think one of the things that we haven't addressed in this program so far, my colleagues, is actually it's been quite remarkable how united the European Union has been in terms of its negotiation with the UK. It has, in fact, coordinated and maintained a stance amongst 27 countries, which in fact have very different economic interests, and in some ways that's perhaps surprising. And I guess if one was in the difficult position of being president of the European Commission or one of the leaders of the EU. Maybe that's a positive sign going forward for the EU. I'm not sure it's so positive for the UK, perhaps, but it's probably positive, perhaps, for the European Union as an organization. Maybe they are going to cooperate and collaborate more effectively in the coming year ahead.
See, whether positive or negative, we'll definitely be closely following the developments on the continent. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
Since its inception in 1993, the European Union has played an integral role in bringing diplomatic, economic, and societal integration and harmony on the continent. Now the whole world is paying close attention on how the EU members will come together to overcome challenges they're facing. That's all we have for this week's The Point World Affairs. Thank you for tuning in and see you again next week.